All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Once again, my name is Martin Tully with the Chicago office of Ackerman LLP and co-chair of the data law practice. We've had three panels that have touched upon what the cyber threat landscape is, both from a risk and a liability standpoint, the challenge of insider threats, and a panel with respect to how to mitigate or prepare for the threats and try to not be the one that the bear catches, but to outrun the guy in front of you and be reasonable standard plus. Now we want to talk about, and this panel is going to focus on the situation of when the proverbial you-know-what has hit the fan, and now what do you do? For this panel, we have an all-star cast. So we have four folks here. The two gentlemen you already know, and we won't reintroduce them, Jason Strait and Keith Lowry. But joining us for the first time, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves very briefly because I could not possibly do them justice. On the left, Joel Heft. Joel?
I think you should do me justice. It's a real honor to be here today. I am Joel Heft. I'm with Equifax. Next week, 20 years with Advocacy. Thinking that I'm either decent at what I do and I just haven't figured out that I don't know what I do yet. Started there way back in '97 as Canadian General Counsel. That led to running their international legal, regulatory, and government relations group, which I did for a decade. November 2015, we were in Australia. Group of us and our CEO and the head of our direct-to-consumer business, an Equifax term, Colin told me that I would be taking on the role of Senior Vice President, I've got to read it because it keeps changing, Senior Vice President of Equifax's Global Breach and Regulatory Response business, which I've been doing now for 14 months. It has been a hell of a ride, and really excited to speak with you all about that a bit today.
Well, thanks for coming out to join us. And also joining us on this panel is Herbert Joe. Herbert, you want to introduce yourself real quickly?
Sure.
Understanding everyone has the bios in their packets.
Thank you. My name is Herbert Joe. I appreciate being here. First of all, just a little correction. I'm a registered patent attorney with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, but I'm not with the USPTO. I live by there, but so I'm really not with them. And also, as of this morning, I'm the de facto fashion coordinator for CTL, just to let you know. I've been practicing law for the last 20 some odd years. I'm a registered patent attorney. I do patents, trademarks, trade secrets, whatever. But also a forensic expert. I also analyze audio, acoustic, voice, and video evidence. Been doing that for 30 years. So I appreciate being here.
Thank you. And once again, our focus is going to be on what happens when the breach has occurred. And we're going to, of course, we had to start with another cartoon, which I think harkens back to some of the things we discussed earlier about the concept of cybersecurity being lost on many individuals within an organization. So this is probably the fellow who clicked on that phishing email and allowed a whole bunch of malware into the system of some company. And as I mentioned earlier, suddenly his direct deposit accounts have been changed, other caches of information have been locked up with ransomware, all kinds of things are going horribly wrong. And this is when you pull out that incident response plan. And we're going to talk about that first. So should every organization have an incident response plan? And if so, what are some of the key objectives of an incident response plan? And pay no attention to the fact they're all in the bullet points on the screen. Panelists, incident response plan. There's an old saying about if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Is that true here?
I'm amazed, and we're talking in the hundreds year to date, how many calls I get, the team gets on a Friday afternoon. They're always on Friday afternoon.
Before a holiday.
Why they're always on Friday? I think people think nobody will notice if we call on Friday afternoon. We've had an incident. A lot of people don't want to call it breach anymore. They say we've had an incident. Tell me. And these are large companies. These are companies that have been to conferences like this one and the many others that are available for people to learn at. And they've done nothing. You know, the first question is, what do we do? And when we start walking through the scenarios, it's almost like the difference, you know, God forbid you have a fire in your house. That's not the time to start, you know, looking for a ladder. That's not the time to put up a fire alarm. It's not the time to look for a hose. You know, having it prepared in advance really helps. So my first advice to anybody is, you know, have an incident response plan, but not that ends at, okay, we brought someone really smart to look at our system. That's great to do. All the stuff you've heard already today, very great insight from my fellow panelists, but run it through to its logical conclusion, which is you've had a breach. You've had, let's just use the PII, you've had personal information that has been the subject of that breach. You're going to have, I think you ran through the state requirements, the federal requirements, all of the requirements. You have to do something. You need to do something. Walk through that one. I think Jason was talking about tabletop earlier. Too many tabletops. I've sat in on some, and I'm the guy at the end of this. Hang on, what about the back end? And we'll talk about a little bit about that later on in the session, but follow it through to its conclusion. Don't just stop halfway through.
I guess I would take your failing to plan is planning to fail quote and raise you with another quote, which is, I think this is a Dwight Eisenhower quote, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So, and I think that is very appropriate here because the goal of creating an incident response plan is not so that you can say you have one and check the box. We use that term a lot. It's to actually have a plan that you can use or refer to when an incident occurs. So, you know, another thing we say a lot is the only thing worse than not having an incident response plan is having one that you don't use or that nobody even knows exists, or you have to dust it off the shelf. So, you know, approaching, it's not the plan itself, it's having a reliable, tested process that you can turn to in a crisis that needs to be the goal of the exercise.
And one thing I'll just add to this is having the pieces lined up. Someone spoke earlier today about having the necessary components within the organization already identified and who's going to do what when this happens, so you're not all looking at each other in the organization as well. Is that Mary's job or is that Bill's? Who was going to do that again? And oh my goodness, Sarah's on vacation. Now what do we do? The assets have to be lined up internally, but your external assets should be known in advance. If you know you're going to have to call in a computer forensics team to figure out what happened and check your logs and track down the malware and exterminate it, that is not the time to pull out the yellow pages and try to find a company to do that. The first 72 hours are key. First 72 minutes are key. Taking a week to just find someone to help you out and going through an RFP process or something ridiculous like that is not the time to do this. General best practices is to not only have somebody already lined up and ready to go, but to have an A team and a B team. So for whatever reason, the A team has a conflict or doesn't have capacity because they're out running around doing another data breach response. You can get somebody who comes in immediately on a moment's notice. That's also true with respect to legal advice, and we'll talk about having outside legal as part of that team. You need to have your lawyers already lined up and ready to go. An incident response is not the time to suddenly start dialing around to find out whether your law firm can handle this or not. And again, having an A team and a B team in case there's conflicts, for example, and you might say, well, what conflict could there possibly be? Think of the situation of where the breach involves a third-party cloud provider and the access to the information has really gone off to a third party. Well, if that law firm also represents that third party, you can see the obvious conflict and you may have to go to plan B. So the first, go ahead, Keith.
I like this in three words. Advocacy, authority, and agility. And it all starts at the top. The CEO and the board of directors have to advocate for these programs. You can't just say, well, we'll support it when it comes up. They need to actively get out in front of it. authorize. They need to assign and delegate someone who has the authority to act on all of the matters. Too many times I've seen corporations say, well, I can't do it because the CEO hasn't told me I can do it. And that's too late. Seconds count. And the last one is agility. We talked about it briefly. If your response is not as agile as the adversarial's response is, then you're going to lose. You have to be able to go where the advocacy is, where the adversary is gone, and to be able to protect your company, you've got to be as flexible and as agile as they are.
So we'll go right into it now. And the first rule of thumb for responding to a data security incident comes from a Douglas Adams book. Anyone read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? All right, well, we all know what the first rule there is don't panic. Because you have an incident response plan, you've identified your internal assets, you have on speed dial the people outside the company you're going to call, and you're going to put these pieces into order because you actually have tested it and you know how things are going to work. So let's now turn to some of the things that you want to do upon first notification of breach, which again, sometimes can be significantly down the road from when the breach occurred. The breach may have happened, you may not have learned about it for some period of time. It could be days, weeks, and in some instances even months before it comes to your attention. But the urgency is no less just because the initial infiltration or exfiltration happened at some distant time. So let's go through some of these points here, which all come from pretty standard sources for things to do in response to a data breach. And we don't want to call this that dreaded checklist word, but these are more points of discussion for our panelists in terms of some of the things that are really important to address in those precious hours after an incident is identified. And the first is to engage the team, as we just mentioned. They engage an outside forensics team. And let's talk a little bit about identifying what the scope is and how that can be deceiving.
Well, if I could, I'll pass it on after, but right to the word notify and engage the team. What I see a lot of, and I'd be interested to see if you all see the same, is so that the proverbial hits the fan, to quote you a couple of times today. The immediate reaction seems to be, in the vast majority of cases, let's pull our wings in, let's throw a cloud of secrecy around, and let's absolutely limit the amount of people that are involved. That sounds right, but if you've chosen solid providers beforehand, you should, what's the point of choosing them if you're then not comfortable bringing them in at the initial stage? Like your thoughts on it, but I'm called into, well, let's put it this way, I'd say about 40% of the calls I get on Friday afternoon end up being a breach which requires post-breach remediation. A lot of the times, what goes on in those first stages ends up being, okay, we're okay. Somebody came in and they didn't get anything. Actually, we thought they got in, but they never did. Not having your trusted advisors in the room, in my opinion, will likely set you back as opposed to protect you.
I mean, I think it depends, obviously, on the scenario. But I think, you know, to refer to another point that's up here on privilege, I think that if you have a situation, we'll call it an incident, you don't necessarily know that there's been a breach, but that there's been an incident, somebody's had unauthorized access to your environment. You don't know whether they got PII or PHI. But you need to begin an investigation. You know there's a possibility of that kind of data being exposed. I would advocate for bringing counsel in, engaging outside counsel immediately, and then having a discussion around privilege. Because if you don't have that discussion early on, and I've seen this happen many times, if you wait until you know that you've had a breach, right, and you need to bring in, you know, resources to help with the notification and these other things. Yes, you can still at that point have counsel engage, you know, another forensics provider and sort of cloak that in privilege, but you can't go backwards. You can't retroactively apply privilege and work product protection to everything that's been done up to that point. So I think you have to, and the reason it impacts your question, Joel, is that if you decide that you are going to assert privilege and work product protection over the investigation and response process, then you've got to limit. You've got to limit the number of people that are on the inside, because if that group gets too big, it jeopardizes your ability to assert privilege.
Just one other thing, the bullet point on call law enforcement. Just given the vast number of federal agencies out there, many of y'all probably wouldn't know who to call first, but in addition to Secret Service or the Department of Homeland Security, consider that the FBI has a cyber task force in every one of its 56 field offices. So, and they have a policy called call to one is call to all. So if you call them and they need assistance from another agency or whatever, they'll be the one helping you out to do that, rather than just say, oh, you need to call this or whatever. So just something to think about there.
Good point. And one thing we'll touch upon a little bit later is that internal question of when to call the feds, so to speak. We'll pick up on a comment that one of the panelists made about what type of external resources that a company might need after the incident has occurred. And I just have to say, this reminds me of 2 law firms ago. We used to have a similar naming process where after a hearing or a trial, the report back to the client, there were only 2 outcomes. There was either unresounding, unmitigated victory, or there had been a development in the case. That's what incident reminds me of here. We've had an incident. I'm sorry, I digress. So what of some of the external resources that are there, comments from the panelists on things that companies should be thinking about, or other organizations should be thinking about in advance? Some of you can read that.
So, in my past, doing some investigations with corporations, the first question as an investigator that I would ask the CEO is, if I find out who's done this, are you going to be willing to take them to court, either for a criminal action or for a civil action? And are you willing to expose the intellectual property that's associated to an open courtroom? And if they can't answer both of those yes, then I would say, then I can't help you. So that is something that every corporation needs to set up ahead of time, is will I be, if I bring in law enforcement, will I be willing to take this person to court and charge them? And am I willing to expose our intellectual property to public presentation? Those are 2 key questions that most corporations have not thought through.
I'd just add that if you look at the 4 balls on the right, in the event that you have to notify, and in the event that you opt to provide credit monitoring, it's a lot of people think, okay, I've made the decision, I'll swallow the cost, I'm done. Not that easy. So, providing credit monitoring or making the decision to provide credit monitoring is part of the decision-making process. What people fail in the terms of failing to think through in advance is, okay, assume, my first question to any company that calls me, if it's a breach of 100,000 people, even if it's a breach of 25,000 people or more, okay, that's great that you've decided that you're going to notify. It's too bad you have to notify. It's great that you're going to provide credit monitoring to help protect the individuals affected. Who's going to answer the calls? Who's going to answer the 25,000 or the 100,000 or the 2 million calls that come in on the incident? Because if you have the staff sitting there ready to answer those calls, you've got a bigger problem than your data breach, because there's a lot of people on your payroll that aren't fully occupied. Who's going to mail those notices? Mailing 100,000 letters, in addition to what you do day to day, that's a massive, massive endeavor. Understanding that your regulators are going to want to see proof of mailing, they're going to want to see how you handle return mail, they're going to want to see your effort to resend mail, which leads to the address append that most people don't think of is, how do I vet these addresses? Because a lot of companies have old addresses. Basically, unless it's your current employee base, there's a chance that a good percentage of your addresses are incorrect. How are you going to make sure those are sanitized and properly set. And my favorite, identity restoration. So you're offering the credit monitoring, and one of our competitors ran a really effective commercial on this, and they were right. Now, they're at the back end of the process, they're not as good at the front end, but their commercial was a dentist who would go into a patient's mouth and say, yeah, you got a pretty bad cavity in your back right molar. And the patient would say, okay, can you fix it? No, I can just tell you have it, I can't fix it for you. So a lot of people don't think about identity restoration, which is that bottom ball, which is if the credit monitoring identifies an issue, you then throw up your hands and say, now it's your problem, consumer, to fix. Or do you want to do that white glove treatment at the back end? Again, not advocating for any or all of them, just trying to set out the logical progression that the mind should go through, again, in advance of the incident happening.
I want to come back to the intellectual property point that was raised and ask Herbert about it, but just to pick up on something that you just said, Joel, and why what Joel said is important, is remember we were talking about the various state data breach notification statutes. A lot of them will require certain things to be communicated to the data subjects, and the important thing here is it's the place of residence of the data subjects that matters, not where they work or not where the company may be located. It's where the data subjects reside. So it's the state has its interest in protecting its own residents, and it's going to require that notification be given to their residents in a specified way. And so to Joel's point, there may be thousands and thousands of people you have to notify in multiple states, and each of those letters can't be necessarily one big mass mailing, because you have to tailor them to the requirements of each state. Some states require that you put, for example, the state's attorney consumer protection division information on for them to contact. Some actually make you address the topic of credit monitoring or identity restoration in the notice and to the Attorney General's office as well as to the data subjects. And having a mechanism by which to do this can be very important, particularly in some jurisdictions where the notification has to be given in a pretty short time frame. So you have to be able to pull all this together. And just because you think, well, okay, this state requires 10 days, Louisiana, but I've got all kinds of time in these other states, not really. Because once the first letter goes out, as a practical matter, it's on social media, it's out to the media, it may find its way to a regulator in another state who, by the way, regulators don't like to find things out from consumers. They want to be notified by the company first, not by some consumer that, well, gee, I live in Illinois, but my colleague who lives across the border in Indiana got a data breach notice. I haven't gotten a notice. Where's my notice? So I call up the Attorney General, Lisa Madigan of Illinois, and suddenly now I'm on her radar screen. That's what you want to avoid. So all this stuff needs to be done a lot sooner than I think most organizations think. I'm off my soapbox. Herbert, the intellectual property question is actually a good one, and I'll skip past these because there are some good guidelines out there for data breach response that the FTC and the Department of Justice have put out, as well as the American Bar Association. But I want to go to the, how did that happen?
Something got hacked.
We've been hacked. That's not even the presentation I'm looking at.
That's very strange.
That is very strange.
You shifted to lunch. That's the lunch presentation.
I know. That's not what's on my screen, though. That's the funny part.
There we go.
We have the technology. We had the technology. All right, well, at any rate, while we're getting that addressed, Herbert, the intellectual property question, if the incident involves an intellectual property of the company, what are some of the issues that are involved there?
Shouldn't surprise you, there are a lot of issues, and of course you raised one, but y'all touched on privilege. Let me just briefly talk about that. There are quite a few issues. I mean, one obviously is the investigation team should hire a computer forensic expert, because that expert obviously needs to preserve electronic evidence. And the obvious reason why that's so important is that litigants are legally obligated to preserve evidence for the other side. So attorneys have an ethical obligation to make sure that their clients aren't possibly sanctioned for spoliation. Spoliation is where the court determines that somebody destroyed or deleted evidence, and the only reason why they did that is because the evidence was not good for their side. So if the court finds spoliation, then the court is also going to instruct the jury. It's called the adverse inference rule. And that's basically, the judge is going to tell the jury that, well, the reason why one side didn't produce the evidence, and they should have, is because the evidence would have been really bad for them. So you, the jury, are allowed to infer adversely that that evidence really was bad. Picking up on the earlier parking analogies, imagine pulling into a parking garage late one afternoon and you get your parking ticket. You run a 30-minute errand, you go back to your car and you want to exit, and then you realize you lost your ticket. So the jury there is the parking attendant, and the parking attendant, because you didn't preserve the evidence of when you went into the garage, he's going to charge you for the whole day. So, and then one of the slides is Federal Rules of Evidence 37E. That just has to do with safe harbor provisions. There's no sanctions if you don't produce electronically stored information, so long as the loss is due to routine, good faith operation of the electronic information system. But the key words there are routine and good faith. So if you do something that's not routine in the ordinary course of business, then there is no safe harbor provisions for you. If you do something routine but not in good faith, and case law even shows that you could be negligent, and that will keep you out of the safe harbor. Y'all brought up attorney-client privilege and work product. Let's briefly talk about that, because it's an attorney's obligation to know the applicability and the scope of attorney-client privilege. So attorney-client privilege, as you know, is when it promotes full discussions between the attorney and the client. So that type of confidential discussions is protected. But because full disclosure of the truth is hindered because of attorney-client privilege, then it's narrowly construed, and the party who wants to use the privilege of attorney-client privilege has the burden of proving that the privilege applies. So when does attorney-client privilege apply? Well, obviously one is the communication has to be about legal advice. You can't talk to your attorney about business reasons or business purposes. Attorney-client privilege won't apply there. And it has to be from an attorney in his or her capacity as an attorney. And then, of course, the information, the conversation has to be held in confidence. It can't be intended for a third party, otherwise the privilege won't apply. Or if it's accidentally leaked to a third party, then the privilege is waived. So companies with a data security breach should consider, as we mentioned, retaining outside counsel and outside IT specialists to investigate the breach. Because if it's an internal investigation, attorney-client privilege probably will not apply. Because if you think about it, in-house counsel, it'd be certainly a lot cheaper and quicker to consult with in-house counsel. But the problem there is in-house counsels oftentimes have dual roles, if not more. Sure, in-house counsels are attorneys, but they also have roles as corporate directors or business officers. So the bottom line is the distinction between legal advice, which is covered by attorney-client privilege, and technical or business advice, which is not covered. The distinction between those two will be much more obvious to the court if you consulted with outside counsel from the start. And then one last thing, again, just because it was brought up, is work product. Work product is not a privilege, it's really a qualified immunity that protects from discovery items and documents prepared by attorneys or attorneys' agents and parties or their representatives. It's meant to, it encompasses the attorney's mental impressions, trial strategies, but it'll be protected as long as it was made of litigation. So these items or documents, if they don't have any analytical or creative input by the attorney, in other words, it wasn't made in anticipation of litigation, it will not be protected. So business documents, they may be helpful for litigation, but they're not going to be protected unless they were made in anticipation of litigation. If the same documents were made in the ordinary course of business, they will not be protected. So again, hiring outside counsel makes a clear statement to the court that what you were doing was in anticipation of litigation, and therefore the privilege or the work product discovery rule will apply.
Yeah, absolutely, totally right, Herbert. I think it's useful to remind everybody of those protections, which we often have to do even with the in-house counsel or their clients. But just a quick note, I think there are now 3 federal district courts that have protected attorney-client, work product protection that had been asserted over forensic reports in the wake of a data breach. But it was in all 3 situations where outside counsel engaged a forensics firm and directed the work, and where the court really looked at where did the report go, and the fact that the report was only shared, was delivered to outside counsel only shared it with inside counsel. It did not go to the internal security team. It did not go to any of the other sort of stakeholders within the company. So yeah, so it can be tricky business to protect that.
Curveball to these guys?
Sure. We love curveballs.
I'll play my Canadian attorney card here. Complete ignorance. It's a joke. You see a lot of attorneys now, externally, outside counsel, taking on, and in the last year this industry has boomed, what they call breach coach. I don't know if you're familiar with the term breach coach. Well, breach coach comes in and not only gives legal advice, but they basically quarterback the whole breach response effort. And I'm just wondering how that fits, because under privilege, is everything covered in your opinion because the breach coach is an attorney, or is it only certain aspects covered?
Right. I'll answer that real quickly. One myth is that facts can somehow be covered by work product and attorney-client communication. They cannot. Facts are facts. They are not privileged. What the opinions and advice and analysis are is another story. And if something is done at the direction of counsel, which is why you engage outside counsel to do those forensic examinations, that can constitute work product. But the common misconception is just because you took a fact that you don't like and you put it in an email and sent it to a lawyer and branded it attorney-client privilege does not make it privileged.
But what about all the other aspects of what the breach coach does, like retaining all the conversations, for example, that I would have in my capacity as, breach response for Equifax, credit monitoring, all that? Would that be privileged?
Your conversations with the
Third-party attorney.
I don't think so. Is the client participating as well? Or it's just between?
Usually the clients are.
You guys,
Just something I struggle with because I don't know if that's covered or not. And
It depends on what you're talking about.
I believe the client thinks it's
If it's,
covered.
yeah.
Well, and then that's why it's important to engage outside counsel right off the bat, because you can't even have that conversation if you haven't done so. And number 2, this is something that needs to be thought of as part of the incident response plan, so you're not all running around in that 24, 48, 72-hour period trying to figure out, is this going to be privileged or not? I don't know, do you know? Well, wait a minute, you're from Equifax, don't you know this? I know, you're from Ackerman, don't you know this? And this needs to all be worked out in advance.
Yeah, and I think you definitely want to clarify what is it that we're going to be talking about, and why are we even concerned about, whether it would be protected or not, right? So that's you want to be careful to constrain.
Right. What are you trying to do?
Of the conversation.
I want to throw a curveball back, because the other tension that happens is your internal IT team obviously has a strong motivation to resolve whatever the it is that's going on, and it's been discovered as quickly as possible. And yet you're going to engage an outside team and counsel. So you have this balance of, number one, plugging the dam as quickly as possible, but then also making sure that you're still taking, what does Rule 37E say, reasonable measures to avoid the loss or altercation of potentially responsive information. And if you're in a target type of situation, you know there's going to be a lawsuit. How do you achieve that balance of making sure that you're stopping the bleeding and yet you're preserving what you need to so that you don't run into a spoliation claim? How does that, from the computer forensics side, how do you walk the edge of that knife?
I could start with that.
I just wanted to take the focus off of me for a while.
I can start with that because it's a great question, and it's a big challenge. The number one problem that we face in coming in to do forensics is the lack of visibility, the lack of log data. And so very often our initial focus is we want to lock down absolutely everything that there is to lock down from a log perspective. Logs, it's relatively easy, and when I say logs, I'm talking about all of the automatically created records of computer activity. All of our devices are creating records, event logs at all times. And some of them are being stored for a period of time, some of them are not. Those event logs are often the key factor in determining whether we're able to ever figure out what happened. And so that's always a focus, is what logs do you have, how long are you preserving them today, and can we extend that? So basically you want to turn all logging on. If it's not turned on, anywhere it is turned on, you want to make sure those logs are going to stay put and not be overwritten, or timed out. Now, where it gets a little trickier, and logs are relatively easy because you can preserve logs without disrupting the business. It's basically just adding some more disk, adding more storage, and making sure those logs are getting directed someplace where they're going to be kept. Where it gets more difficult is, which is probably what you're referring to, is when you need to get disk and memory, when you need to do, real forensics on the network, and take a machine offline in order to get a forensic image and those kinds of things. And definitely, I think that you made the comment earlier, Martin, that there's so many companies doing such a terrible job at this, so many companies that have a complete disregard to this issue whatsoever, that as long as there's some kind of thought process involved saying, hey, what is the cost benefit of taking these systems offline so that we can image them versus the evidentiary value of what we think we're going to get, as long as you can show you're going through that process, somehow you're probably going to be okay. And I would say, if we come in and there are 100 machines that appear to be infected with malware, I think it's safe. I don't know a forensics firm that would come and say, well, we need to image and do forensic analysis on all 100 machines. That would be disruptive, it would be very expensive, and probably the evidentiary value of doing that probably would not be that great. You need to image a handful, I would say probably 10, take a random sampling, and that should give you a pretty good indication what kind of malware you're dealing with. So making those kinds of decisions on the fly is a really important part of the process. And that's, again, where counsel directing that activity can be helpful. Because what you don't want in that situation is, you don't want your forensics firm explaining why they only imaged 10 out of 100. Right? And that's the kind of stuff that you can protect with work.
Right. Go ahead. I want to go back to a couple things, because we have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, and you do want to touch upon 2 of the things real quickly before we leave. But go ahead, Keith.
I just wanted to say that this is a great example of why you have to do preparation sessions. You have to do training tabletops, because these are the kinds of questions that come up and they have to be resolved, and that's the place to resolve them.
Exactly. Herbert?
Yeah, you just raised the point. It just reminds me of a case. There's a federal court in California that held that the data stored in a computer's RAM is defined as electronically stored information that must be turned over in litigation, even though RAM is not in permanent storage, it is continually being updated, changed, deleted, overwritten. That's kind of scary thought.
Yes, and I know that was the Bunnell case that we were talking about, but I remember that one. And it was specific to that case, I believe, but you're right, that ephemeral type of ESI, sometimes you have to preserve, and knowing about it and identifying that early on is critical. Two things we want to touch on real fast before we wrap up at 2 is number one, the question was asked earlier, so when do you call the feds? And the quote here from President Ronald Reagan was mentioned by Mr. Sutherland earlier today in his remarks, but I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Reagan said that those are the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. Was I'm from the government, I'm here to help. On the other hand, Admiral Michael Rogers, former commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, is basically pointing out that this is not something that you can address in isolation. You need to call in help. And the real question, real quickly for the panel is, when is it appropriate to call in the feds or the authorities? It could be local authorities. And I will just add 2 things in front of that. Number one, in some states, in order to make a risk of harm analysis to decide whether or not you need to notify the State Attorney General's office and data subjects, you can only make that determination in conjunction with law enforcement. So you actually have to work with them to decide whether there's a risk of harm or not. So that would be a situation where you kind of have to. If something's been stolen from you, you certainly might want to call in the vets so they can see if they can help you track it down. And the other last thing I'll say is, and it was mentioned earlier, if you're going to call the authorities, that again is not the time to go fishing through Google or the white pages to find out who to call and get the general number for the local FBI office. Literally, you need to have the card of the person you're going to be contacting, and I have a whole bunch of them back at my office. I know the person in Chicago at the FBI and the Department of Justice and Secret Service to contact directly in case of an incident that affects one of my clients, and that's again part of this preparation process. Know the person to contact. Comments on that from the panel before we go to a communications plan?
Yeah, I can just, again, when to call, well, if you're not sure to call, just call. Just call the FBI. Like I say, there's 56 field offices. There's one here in San Antonio, one in Houston, one in Dallas. But they have a cyber task force, and they can let you know what you need to know. And like I said, if another agency needs to be involved, then they will be the one that will do that for you. So if you're not sure, just call them.
I would make 3 comments. One, the quality and the competence of the cyber agents in the different offices is highly variable. That's all I'll say. 2, the FBI or no law enforcement agency is going to give you free forensics. Some people think, hey, we'll just have the FBI bring their team out and do the forensics and tell us what happened. Maybe they will, but only if they think it's going to help them put somebody in jail. Understand, that is their sole focus. They may feel bad for you, they may have sympathy, but if they don't think they're going to make an arrest, I wouldn't expect much help. 3, you got to be prepared. If you're going to call in law enforcement, you got to be prepared to give up some amount of control over the investigation, because you can't play it both ways. If you're going to call the FBI and ask them to come out, and they start asking you a bunch of questions, you can't say you don't want to answer them. They don't like that. Yeah, and they will tell you, listen, either you want to call with us or you don't. So those are just 3 things.
Good question?
Yeah, no, can I make a comment on all this? Since I've been there are 2 legal regimes that lawyers and companies need to be aware of with regard to this. One is there's a sea change with the new Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 18 months ago, which says that if you share information, a company's pre-redraft shares data with us, with our intake, our Cyber Operations Center, all of the privileges maintained. Nor can we ever give that out in the Freedom of Information Act. You don't have any antitrust issues, you don't have any privileges issues, so you can share that and maintain the control and the information will flow. The second legal regime that is rarely utilized is called Protected Critical Infrastructure Information, PCII. This has been an Homeland Security Act since 2003. And basically what it says is if a company has some sort of vulnerability issues they want to share with the government to try to roll up our sleeves and work together, great, you can share that with us. And we then cannot share that information under any litigation, under any Freedom of Information Act request, congressional request. We can't give it to regulators. And on top of that, you now, by marking it, get protection. That information cannot be shared in civil litigation. Somebody who's suing you cannot get access to that information anymore because it's marked PCII and it's sensitive. That is one that's rarely mentioned, but I just want to flag for you. This is one of the reasons why we go out and speak. There's some legal regimes that are available that the bar is not.
And it's a great point. Thank you for sharing that, because literally we could spend 50 minutes just on CISA, and I have to settle a bet. How do you pronounce CISA?
It's the Cybersecurity Sharing Act system.
Thank you.
But there is,
I won the bet.
It is Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, and that's what we really call CISA. So we're talking about two different things, and whether the chairman wants to be clear on that.
Understood. Thank you for sharing that. Very quickly then, communication plan. Very important as part of your preparation to have some idea of who's going to say what, where, why, and when. And it's not just internally. You've got your employees, obviously. You've got the media. You may have shareholders to deal with. Regulators, as we've already touched upon. And in some instances, the notification to state authorities can be delayed for good reason because you're working with law enforcement. That's built in many of the data breach notification statutes. But the data subjects, sometimes it's the beneficiaries and dependents of the data subjects, depending on what information has been accessed. Understanding what you're going to say to whom, customers, is very important. I have clients, that when they're still in the process of dealing with all this, have already assigned someone to monitor social media, so they can be on the forefront of what's being said. Because once this gets out, there's only one thing that known to travel twice the speed of light, and that's rumors about these kind of things once a little bit of information gets out. And so having a media plan and a communications plan to these very different audiences is absolutely critical. As I mentioned, one thing that the regulators don't like is to find out from a consumer that you've had a data breach affecting them. They want to find out from you first. And then the other topic before coming back to the panel is, we didn't get to it in the earlier ones, but some of you are probably sitting there saying, I don't need to worry about any of this stuff. I've got insurance. Somebody else will pay for it. We don't have time in the 30 seconds that I have left to talk about cyber insurance, which would be a whole panel by itself. But leave it at this. Most commercial general liability policies have been writing out coverage for cyber insurance or cyber security events for years now. And while there's a few exceptions to that in some court cases, for the most part, that policy is not going to help you. But I have something that says cybersecurity insurance. Aren't I okay? It says cyber insurance. I should be all right. Not necessarily. God bless you. It depends on what the policy says. This is an area that is very much in flux. You have to read these parts. There might be first-party coverage. So, for example, it'll pay for the computer forensic. It'll pay for the lawyers to come in to deal with the breach. It may even deal with replacing your systems and your hardware costs, et cetera, et cetera. It may pay for the notifications to the data subjects, but it may not pay for things like ransomware. It may not pay for, and it might pay for defense of a lawsuit brought by the data subjects affected, but it might not pay, as it did, as P.F. Chang's found out, when their bank sued them and said, hey, we want to recover the cost that we incurred having to deal with the fallout from your data breach. And the banks sued P.F. Chang's, and the insurer in that, for P.F. Chang said, well, we're not covering that, and prevailed. So understanding what is actually covered and what isn't covered, damage to your organization's reputation is often not covered. Ransomware in many policies isn't covered because it's just not viewed to be that external, it's not viewed to be the type of coverage because simply you lost access to your own information. And what you paid in Bitcoin against the advice of the federal government and other agencies is not going to be covered by a policy. I've seen instances where spear phishing, where someone in the company gave the credentials to the bad actors, is viewed to be outside of the coverage of the policy because it wasn't some bad actor who infiltrated the system. Essentially, it was an employee or an insider that handed it over negligently or otherwise. So the moral of the story on insurance coverage is just because it says cyber insurance, don't bank on it. Be very mindful in analyzing what exactly is and isn't covered. So any final thoughts on the panel on communication plans or cyber insurance? We're at 2:02.
Yeah, just on communication plan, one voice, one general, because the worst practice is you got 8 people, each of those categories going out saying 8 different things, so one voice.
Thank you.
Round of applause for the panel. Thank you.